Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar from Reuters Events. This is all about how to become a data-driven digital insurer to unleash your competitive edge. And it's part of our build-up to the AI and Innovative Tech USA conference happening later this year. So watch for more details on that front. I am Brian Falchuk. I'm the host for this webinar, and I'm the managing partner of Insurance Evolution Partners and the author of the book series. I can say series now because the second one's coming soon. Called The Future of Insurance from Disruption to Evolution. And I am very excited to be joined by really wide-ranging panel of perspectives for today's discussion. So we have 4 folks joining me today. I'm gonna hit everyone's names and then we're gonna jump right into thoughts from everybody about this topic that, look, definitely got accelerated last year, but we're not done. The train has certainly left the station. And so then the question is, well, what are people doing and how are they planning to go from some of the sort of tactical and reactionary things that we had to do because we didn't have a choice all of a sudden, to bringing strategy out of that and thinking longer term about making this stick and moving our organizations, but also our industry forward. It's a really critical time that I know a lot of carriers and providers throughout the industry are thinking through. So really quickly on the panel, and then we're going to jump into thoughts from them. And then what I would love to see from all of the attendees is ask your questions. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. Ask those questions as they come to you. You don't have to wait until the end. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A, so be sure to get your questions in and we'll bring them to the whole panel so everyone can opine. First is Kjersten Moody, who joins us as the Chief Data Officer for Prudential. We have Jeffrey Lee, who's the head of actuarial data and analytics for North America for Swiss Re. Wayne Huang, who joins as the head of data science for Pacific Life. I love his background, a nice reminder that he's from Pacific Life. And Charles May, who is the director of Solutions Center of Excellence for Liferay. So with that, actually, Kjersten, if you wouldn't mind opening things up and sharing some thoughts for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you, Brian. So I think, to sort of launch the topic, so my name is Kjersten Moody. I have been with Prudential since June of last year as the inaugural Chief Data Officer for Prudential. So as part of joining Prudential, I am also standing up the Chief Data Office within the company. So prior to that was with State Farm, and prior to that was in a different industry altogether. So I think to launch the topic today, it's what I have definitely experienced over the last 12 months, and certainly thinking back over the last several years, is that this topic of data and analytics is very much sort of increasingly and on an accelerated basis linked to true business transformation. So there's much more of a pull for what data science, analytic teams can contribute into the broader, more enterprise thinking about business strategy and what that results in with execution plans and strategic roadmaps and so forth. So it's really pervasive. It's very broad-based, what we're seeing across all parts of the business, from the customer-facing, front office type of activities through to the back office and what that type of transformation looks like. And it's really sort of a very interesting and exciting catalyst that is pushing on topics we've been working on for quite some time, but have perhaps been more difficult to make progress on. So the technology strategies and how we think about adoption in public cloud paradigms, or working with a startup ecosystem, for example, how we think about talent, and really from an enterprise perspective, what type of data talent and data skills do we need, not just in a data and analytics organization, but in the partnering or the receiving organizations as well. And then very importantly, governance, sort of pushing on some of the bread and butter governance topics into thinking about how do we have a more sophisticated way of thinking about responsible and ethical uses for artificial intelligence across the business. What are some sort of deeper thoughts around privacy, information security, given some of the new architectural or solution paradigms that are coming into operation. And then sort of the tried and true data management and governance programs are really coming into their own and kind of being pulled into greater strategic focus and more kind of top line strategy for needing to have robust programs there. So it's really been a kind of a fascinating 12 months to see sort of the pull from across the business for not only an acceleration of strategies coming from data and analytics teams, but also that pull to have the data and analytics strategies really have the intersection with the business strategy and the business transformation aspirations.
I think that is absolutely spot on. And if you're, so maybe a warning or call to action, if you're planning a strategy for your organization on the business side and you're not thinking about data or how your data plays in, or even, I mean, you mentioned data governance and sort of thinking through what is our data, how we're using it ethically and otherwise, or the things that the data enables. If you're not thinking through that today in this environment, you're absolutely behind, because that's not the way the industry operates, certainly anymore, but absolutely going forward. So great call out. Data governance can be an exciting thing because it enables so much if you get it right, and it will disable so much if you don't, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That, however, in my personal experience historically, has been a sales pitch. Yeah. Whereas now people are kind of coming to me saying, "Hey, we have to get this right. Let's partner to figure it out." So that's sort of the nuance in the shift, but it's very important where it's less of a push from the topical expertise into the business and more of a pull from the business. Yeah. To have that expertise brought into kind of the broader enterprise thinking.
Oh, that's great.
So very exciting times, very exciting.
Absolutely. Thank you for those opening thoughts. And I should say a couple of things popping in the chat. If you have questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A, but those were more logistical ones. So I will say the recording will be made available to everyone who registered, so you will get that. And someone asked for the slide deck. There are no slides, so you don't need to worry about the deck. You just get the recording and you'll have everything you need. With that, Jeffrey Lee, who joins us from Swiss Re North America, I'd love some thoughts from you on the subject.
I would just say, like, in addition to what Kjersten's saying, you know, she looks at this from very much, I would say, like the data trustee perspective, very high level. In data and analytics at Swiss Re, our team is just going very fast right now. It's a flat out sprint to sort of integrate and build pipelines of data, try to find external sources of data as quickly as possible and get it organized. I lead a team of now what are, I guess, newly described as actuarial data engineers, you know, not traditional data engineering, but really can you go very quickly to, you know, bring data in a context that's useful for analytics from very much a pricing and profitability perspective. And I think what we, you know, often find ourselves in a position in the actuarial function is what, you know, once the business finds out we have these metrics and we have data, then of course everybody wants this, and we end up spending a lot of our time just doing reporting and KPI metrics. So part of the challenge at Swiss Re is really just freeing up the actuaries from sort of the day-to-day grind of, you know, sort of the business functions they get pulled into, but also trying to automate some of their processes so they can move into R&D and more machine intelligence, you know, tools. The big challenges that we're running into, I think, you know, when you're talking about data internally and externally, you know, it comes down to ownership, right? So, you know, who owns the data internally, you know, that becomes, you know, kind of unclear and ambiguous when so many people now are focused on this and have access to this. You know, even if you're dealing with partnerships and sort of data exchange, then you really have to think carefully about sort of the rules of engagement for, you know, if you combine your data together and the products that come out of this, you know, what ownership, you know, do you really engage on for, you know, the products that come out of collaborative data work. And then I would just add finally that from a cultural perspective, you know, at Swiss Re, we're trying to shift the entire company to become more data literate. And involved with the sort of stewardship, curation, governance, responsibility of, producing data in a way that, I think number one, doesn't create multiple Frankenstein copies of the same data, right? That's a challenge. But then, if you have so many people working on it, then, I think ownership, from a cultural perspective becomes challenging as well.
And I imagine especially Swiss Re has a lot of different businesses and a lot of different lines you engage in and geographies, et cetera. And I know you're focused on North America, but does that should complicate it even more, doesn't it? Because everyone is sort of working on their own business, if you will, without necessarily feeling like it's an overlap. So we're all in this together, because there's these discrete, very, sizable and well-established sort of subunits, if you will.
Yeah, the regional really comes into play. So if you're dealing with different regulatory regions and also different languages or I guess customs for how you do insurance, then it's very difficult to sort of enable that and manage it from a global perspective. So I think you have to have some sense of governance and master data and try to create a single source of the truth. But at the same time, it has to sort of branch off into while still being attached to, sort of some backbone of data, you still have to allow the freedom for, sort of different areas of the world to operate the way they would like to.
Yeah. You mentioned ownership. I think that's a theme that's going to come up in the Q&A. So heads up on that, because that is actually huge. And there's the customer side of it too. If you're collecting the data from them, where does ownership lie? What uses are acceptable? And you might have the use you defined it for, but as your business evolves and needs evolve and the data might be able to enable something else, can you still use it for that new purpose if it wasn't defined up front? And these are all nuances that I think a lot of us in the industry are sort of live navigating through in real time.
Yeah, there's a lot of ambiguity around this. And,
yeah.
The culture goes with that, even internally with ownership topics. Who should own the data from, let's say, a trustee or a curator or a steward perspective. That everybody wants to own the data, but I think from my perspective, if you own the data, that comes with a lot of responsibility to ensure its accuracy and proper use.
Yeah, good point. Thank you for that, Jeffrey. Huang, joining us from Pacific Life. Love to hear your perspectives.
Thank you. Yeah. So good morning. It's my pleasure to be here and join the panel. So I think that life insurance has come a long way in the data analytics journeys. So at first, we used the descriptive tool like Cognos, Tableau to dissect the data, and so we can analyze what the business performance is. Then we start building predictive models to find out the drivers of the key business activities like pricing, underwriting, claims, lapse, propensity to buy, etc. Right? So through these models, we learned which data is important in telling story, and by focusing on these data, we can identify the signals that that tell us what is to come. So then business can take the action to prepare for it. So idea really for me is to build a digital sense and response organization that are supported by data and AI models. Right? So think about a scenario where the relevant data are being collected and captured continuously. And the data can be fed into tens or hundreds of different models running in real time or batch. And this model then can produce analyses that will advise the managers that what to do, what's the action to take. And then I think the other laws for data science is to enable product innovations. So we may think that the data science has already covered many areas in the insurance space, but my experience at a fintech startup and also at traditional carriers tell me that there are still many opportunities out there based on my own observations. So one way to figure out these opportunity and new product is to see that any activities and decisions are still done by humans, right? Then that present opportunity for automation using the new tools. And most of the time, this reason for the decision that's still performed by humans are because either they involve too many variables or the problems are still ambiguous. right? But machine learning, we know, is very good at kind of analyzing this large number of variables, or it can help us to kind of test different hypotheses. So the question could be, or problem can be clarified. Right? And the other thing is we also see a surge of a lot of new data being provided by third-party providers. And some of these new data are very helpful. So, and we are not longer kind of limited by the internal data anymore. So by using the new data, we may be able to answer all questions or new questions, for those analytic related questions.
The third-party data, the external data, that's come up a few times now. That I'm predicting that's another source of questions for the Q&A, which is a subtle hint to ask questions in the Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
That's great point. So Wayne is opening us up from some of the constraints that we've had in the past. Those because we didn't have the data ourselves or couldn't collect it ourselves. Well, there's new ways to get our hands on some of that data. So very, very good point. And I see some things popping in the chat that look like questions. So make sure you put those in the Q&A so we can manage the question flow. Charles, joining us from Liferay, if you would share some thoughts with us.
Great, thanks, Brian, and good morning, everyone. Just a point of clarification from the beginning. So despite our name, Liferay is not a life insurance provider, as some have mistakenly assumed in the past. In fact, we're actually a software and professional services company that was established back in 2004. And our flagship product, Liferay Digital Enterprise Platform, has made us a leader in Gartner's DXP Magic Quadrant for 11 years in a row. During that time, we've worked with close to 200 insurance organizations worldwide. And more recently, we've invested significantly in developing offerings that leverage our platform capabilities to provide solutions in different verticals. And one of those key verticals is the P&C insurance industry. So in my role, I help lead efforts in creating those solutions. So, we just heard from my fellow panelists about how critical your data is in providing that competitive advantage. However, that data is only useful if it provides your customers with a personalized experience that empowers them and makes them feel cared for. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how you can make your data more personal to your users by ensuring that it's accessible, understandable, and relatable. So if we start with accessible, you may be using a robust backend like maybe Duck Creek or Guidewire, but there's a high likelihood that you also have legacy or custom data sources that house some critical data. And if that's the case, you really do need to have a strategy for consolidating all of that disparate data into a single view for easy consumption. So instead of forcing your customers to track down all of that data themselves, perhaps by logging into multiple systems, you should be surfacing it on their behalf and presenting it to them in a unified and streamlined format. Another important consideration is making sure that users can access their data from multiple devices. So for example, if your customer were to get into an auto accident, there's a good chance that their smartphone is going to be their primary tool in helping them to record crucial information for the claims process. So really the question is, can they start a claim on their phone and then complete it when they get back to their home computer? Providing that type of an option is really going to give your customers peace of mind in the midst of obviously an inherently stressful situation. So overall, ensuring that your customers' data is accessible and available at a moment's notice is going to go a long way in giving them confidence that their needs are being met. Then the next thing that I want to talk about is your data being understandable. So your system may have some amazing functionality. It may even provide data insights that cover every scenario you can throw at it. But if the user's interface is cumbersome or clunky, then your customers are not going to get very far or be very impressed. The best way that I can illustrate this is with one of our clients, West Bend Mutual Insurance. So West Bend actually provided their independent agents with a solution that was running on top of a SaaS offering for quoting. And though that SaaS offering provided industry-leading backend services, West Bend felt that their user interface was not intuitive and it was difficult to use. And as a result, it took agents up to an hour to submit a single quote on behalf of customers. And the percentage of agents quoting through the system fell to 20%. But thankfully, there's a happy ending. West Bend engaged with Liferay And we were able to provide a custom interface that's still integrated to their existing backend, but it presented that data in a way that everyone could easily understand. So in the end, agents were actually able to reduce the quoting time from an hour to as little as 5 minutes. And within 5 months of the solution going live, the number of agents quoting online more than tripled from 20% to 65%. So I think the big takeaway here is you don't want to force your users to cater to the structure of your data. Instead, you want to force your data to cater to the needs of your users. And then finally, we want your data to be relatable. So, gone are the days where you can use this one-size-fits-all approach to attract new customers or even upsell to existing customers. You really need to cater your data to the needs to make your offerings as relatable and personalized to them as possible. And I'll give you 2 quick examples. Let's say that you're analyzing the demographics data around your customers. Then you're probably already defining certain user segments. Well, your next step should be to target that content to those segments. So instead of just making a general statement like, you need life insurance, you can find segments, let's say like a 50+ single income earner, family, married with kids, and present a more relatable statement like, give yourself peace of mind by providing for your family in times of hardship. You could also find trends among products that are owned by customers in a particular demographic and make similar product recommendations to prospects that are in that demographic. So really the key is to present the data in a way that customers can naturally connect to. Another good example of relatability is the industry trend towards a direct-to-consumer model. So more and more, there are tech-savvy customers, especially millennials, who would rather research and compare data like policy options on their own, and then quote bind and pay their premium online without needing any outside intervention. This is especially becoming more popular, obviously, in light of COVID. So the more that you can offer them that same familiar, relatable purchasing experience that online retailers like Amazon provide, then the more likely you will be able to gain their business. So again, if data is relatable, it's going to feel more personable, and you can reinforce that customer satisfaction is your focus. So yeah, by making your data accessible, understandable, relatable, you're going to help foster a personal digital experience that empowers your customers.
That's great, Charles. I think what you're hitting on, well, first of all, you had a quote in there that is like, everyone should take that down. And I probably butchered it, but essentially don't force users to bend to the needs of your data. Your data should cater to the needs of your customers and your data and what it enables. Think about the broader experience. So I know it's not exactly how you said it, but I was furiously writing as fast as I could to capture that. that is the notion we should all be holding, especially after the past year that we've been through. And I think a redefinition of the importance of customer experience and people's unwillingness to accept something that really isn't an enjoyable process. They're not going to give us a pass as they might have in prior years because nothing else in their life is like that anymore. So great point. But then also thinking about how can data tie to the ways that we're trying to move in the market, ways that we're trying to engage with people, and thinking about that holistic experience around the data, not just its data separately. We're building this thing over here to interact with people. They should be intertwined, which goes right back to Kjersten, your first point. Think about this strategically as part of what the business is trying to achieve and not a separate thing that can tell us some stuff about what's going on, which I know is not how anyone in this panel feels about it, but data is absolutely intertwined. There's no way to pull it apart anymore, or it should be if it isn't for you. Good news is we have some questions coming in. We still have some going into the chat, so if you put them in there, make sure you hop over to the Q&A button and enter them that way. I'm just going to open it up and I'm going to pass it around to the whole panel so we can get a variety of perspectives on this. GDPR came up, and I know the answer to this will depend on your geographic exposure, but of course there are analogous regulations and rules in different geographies, New York, California, others, and I'm sure many, many more to follow. So I'll say GDPR, but let's use that as a proxy for the privacy regulations that are relevant to your business in your geography. How do you deal with GDPR issues using third-party external data? So I think we'll broaden this to has this come up? How have you faced it? How are you testing for it with some of those partners you're looking at? How are you managing it? Whatever those sorts of themes, as we think about external data sources and staying compliant with privacy regs. Kjersten, do you want to open us up?
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's definitely not a single set of regulations that you need to respect. So I think your expansion of the question is an appropriate one. So you deal with it by dealing with it. Not to oversimplify or to trivialize, but it's a fairly sort of detailed inspection, cross-functionally done with corporate law partners, compliance partners, technology teams, data teams, to really look at the intersection between what the compilation of regulations is in the particular jurisdiction in which you're operating, and what that means for either the internally generated data or data that you're acquiring, and how you kind of go back to contract with that. So, and then, you know, it's changing rapidly. So we're not at the point now where we can automate or sort of overly sort of systematize, you know, that inspection, because the regulations are evolving and we need to kind of stay on top of that and make sure that you know, we're sort of compliant at any given particular moment. So so I think it's a fair amount of care and due diligence, you know, versus here's the pattern, and if you follow this, you'll be fine. Yeah. And then what we are looking at is, as you start to see common denominators, as you start to see, you know, trends and patterns for questions that always need to be asked, how do you start to make that more routine? And are there ways that you can start to build in that early stage automation in the platforms, in the underlying systems that are enabling kind of the onboarding and the downstream usage of data? So, so I think, you know, it's not a terribly elegant answer, is what I have to offer. It's still a fair amount of elbow grease at this point, just making sure that the ins and outs and the layers of regulations are each individually and collectively understood and respected in the use cases that you have.
Well, I think what was clear is you're saying it's an active engagement. It's not a no, which I've definitely seen that, maybe less so today, but it was, oh, well, you know, we can't because of GDPRs. Well, that isn't an answer. Mm-hmm. Yes. Maybe it's something we can work through and find, how do we stay compliant with regulation X, whatever it may be.
Exactly. I think the mindset is, you know, how do we sort of get to some version or some definition of success, right? Where compliance with regulations is a clear factor in what determines that successful outcome.
Yeah. Jeffrey, is that similar to your take on it? Different lines of business, but similar kind of view?
We have actually a very extensive digital governance framework that covers everything from information security, cyber, critical information, regulatory, with you know, issues like GDPR are part of this. So as part of any data use case, we will go through, you know, let's say a small number to a very large number of gates that you have to pass. So you know, I think that, you know, any organization should have this kind of governance framework in place, and then you have a process that's very structured around it. You leave the experts in legal and compliance to advise you on how to navigate this. You know, I don't think, you know, organizations, you should just kind of, we'll figure it out. Not to be critical of what Kjersten was saying, but I think every organization should come up with a, you know, specific function that, you know, becomes really good at addressing these kind of topics.
So if I could just jump in, I didn't mean to communicate ad hocness to it. You know, there is a systematic way to look at it, and the point being that it is cross-functional, and it is with an eye towards, you know, clear kind of undeniable compliance to what we need to do. So, so if you took away that it's sort of use case by use case without any type of sort of systematic approach to it, then that was not an intended sort of implication of my first remarks.
Yeah, not suggesting that at all. Just
Great.
just want to be careful about. We should every organization should have a strategy around this.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% agree with that.
Yeah, and I think you both were clear that there need to be people who are responsible for looking at these things. And Kjersten, you said, you know, your compliance folks, your legal folks, whether that's internal or you have external help, or maybe it's both. Maybe this is an expertise thing, and so you need to call in some help because either the issue is new, change in reg, for example, or maybe the data and the kinds of things that it's looking at and how it's being transmitted is new to your organization, even if it's already out there in the industry. So, you know, there's a need to have a responsible party for these issues. Wayne, would you echo the same things from Pacific Life, or you have a different take on it? How has regulation
I
hit
echo
you?
what Jeff and Kjersten has said. Yeah, so definitely the company has a set of framework in terms of for each of the use case, the model built into what the guardrail that we should look into, you know, for this compliance regulation or privacy standpoint. I think the other thing important also from the the practitioner standpoint, like the data scientist, the data engineer, they should have a good mindset and sense about what means the privacy, what means what these regulations implies, and when they start working on these real data and what should be careful about, right? And in terms of third-party data, mostly they are aggregate data, so actually their concern is not as much. The internal data-wise, how do we make sure that our people has a full understanding about what these implications of these regulations, and then how do we deal with that, and also working with different party compliance regulation and legals, then we learn through the process too. So I say it's a learning process for everyone in the team. So then eventually it just become a routine practice that we embedded in our operations.
Yeah, well, it's a good point, especially when you're using sort of aggregated data about groups of populations, and so it's not about an individual anymore. So that helps with some of that privacy concern. Charles, you're in an interesting spot in this equation then, because your software is helping, or your solutions are helping to facilitate the consumption and presentation of that data that could be at issue. So it gives you an interesting perspective on the equation then.
Right. So, you know, since we are providing these solutions for our insurance customers, we're definitely taking into account the different personal data regulations across all the different regions. So we are making sure that we can capture that data in a way that it can be encapsulated, and we can give our clients the flexibility to do with it what they need, whether it's to remove it, you know, at a customer's request, or to be able to export it, that type of thing. So yeah, that definitely comes into play, not only in insurance industry, but many different industries now. Personal data is an important factor.
Yeah, I think every industry, if not yet, very soon. I mean, there's to think of a business that isn't digital and data. I mean, even you know, landscapers are doing things, you know, through email, like that's digital, right? I mean, it's expanding. There's a very interesting question that one of you, I think, seeded this because you made a comment about continuous data. So, and I can't remember exactly who it was. It might have been Jeff, but
it was Wayne.
That was my next guess. So Wayne, I'm going to start with you because you're to thank for this. So this person said, for insurance, I think the challenge lies in streaming data, or this constant flow of data coming in from IoT or connected devices, or, you know, what have you, where we now see in almost continuous time what's happening to the exposure. And so, you know, noting that, and that there's a time and space aspect to the assets or the lives that we're insuring. So this type of data can be the basis of underwriting, product creation and innovation, and then also claim handling. So the industry works on generally a 12-month cycle for policies. So how do we kind of marry these two things where you have continuous insight, but you have an annual structure on the pricing side and the engagement side? And I'd love to hear your thoughts from Pacific, given that you brought this up.
Sure. So I think, you know, like the person says, the insurance has a 12-month cycle, so the premium based on the annual premium, right? So, and usually these the actuarial model would decide, you know, what these premiums should be or pricing should be. And if we observe any deviation during the time, so then I think usually the variation when they do the pricing, usually it's an annual process. Right? So even though we may see some changes, we may not react to it right away. That's just reality. But then the thing though is to see that how these drift of these the data or results that may change the model, may impact the model going forward, then to learn from that and move with that, that trend. So I think that's probably the best we can do for now, by at least understanding what are the data that comes in and what are the new impact that could brought in by this new data. That's important. Right? So eventually, insurance is not the real-time business. It's more on the discrete steady business for a certain time and then move to another stage. So I think that's what we live with. So that's just reality.
So you said something that led me to want to ask Charles to follow up next. So I know you just spoke a moment ago, so I'm putting you back on the hot seat. But with Huang's point, thinking about this as an annual policy and an annual engagement, absolutely valid, especially from an underwriting standpoint when we think about what's filed and how we can bring that to market. With what you're seeing is almost the customer interaction, which is more real time or could be more real time. Is that where you're seeing some of those constant or more constant data flows becoming something we can use, even if the policy is fixed for that term?
Yeah, I would say so. I think I guess the great thing about data is there can be a lot of it, and therefore there's a lot that you can parse through, but that's also a huge challenge. And so you definitely want a solution that can take all of that data and be able to store it, but also be able to analyze it. So I think, AI and machine learning, that's all becoming very popular in the industry right now, especially in the solutions that we're building, to really be able to parse through all of that data, figure out how do we use it, how do we understand it, and then how does that then translate to how we interact with our customers. So
using it to drive that interaction, that, like, back to your point about how does the customer want to be served, and thinking about data as a way to facilitate that.
Exactly, right, because you don't want to ever make assumptions. I think it's very easy to make assumptions and think that if certain customers do things a certain way, all customers do things a certain way. But again, it really comes back to personalizing to each of the customers.
Kjersten, life is a space where there's been a lot of talk about wearables and whether it's data from your Apple Watch or Fitbit or whatever devices out there. These are continuous flows that historically we haven't had that and haven't used it in underwriting, and there's some activity going on in the space. Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking of in your space, or are there different ways you look at this sort of continuous flows of data?
I think we're looking at a very wide variety of approaches to this, including this type of continuous data and data streams. So thinking about it as a kind of a broadening out of the data ecosystem that we are a participant in is just part of the baseline approach, which includes this kind of continuous data and what would we do with it if we were to have it, and what we do in fact have. So as part of the strategy, and it's sort of one of those very interesting intersections with business strategy at that point, because as you start to have kind of the more sort of streaming data coming in, it's really kind of an expansion of the strategic possibilities then that are on the table as part of strategy setting. So it's actually a lot of fun, and it's very interesting to work back with business partners on what could be as enabled by new and faster sources of data. So it's a fairly generic answer, but I think the short answer is yes, among kind of many different opportunities that we're looking at.
Yeah, well, it is an interesting time that doesn't necessarily jibe with the structure of our products historically.
Correct.
which could just mean, no, we don't do it. Or it could mean, well, maybe it's time to look at those structures because they were created at a time where we didn't have continuous data
Exactly.
streams to underwrite from. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And Jeffrey, you have so many different lines of business and spaces in your domain. Swiss Re really hits a lot of different pieces of the market. How does this come up for you? Because there's so many different ways that continuous data and different kinds of IoT and wearables and whatnot that are kind of swarming around the various lines that Swiss Re engages in. So how does this come into play for you?
There are so many people working on so many things at Swiss Re. It's very difficult to answer that. The example that comes to mind to me, and I don't think anybody's really cracked this yet, this continuous data problem, but the specific example that I can think of is during COVID when the auto insurers came out and they said, okay, we will cut your premiums by 15% because the underlying assumption is that people weren't traveling and the exposure is now reduced. So, in theory, you'd have less claim activity, which I think we saw, right? So much to Wayne's point that, what we're really trying to do is measure trend, and the data is just a signal that describes this process, in so much that we could see this more than, once a year and really spot when there's a trend change. I think insurers can react quicker to sort of reduce premiums or that sort of costing element that comes with reduction in exposure, right? So if you have like a sensor in a car and the sensor measures how many miles you're going daily, right? We can start to differentiate between people who just leave the car in their driveway and have a reduced exposure against those that are, let's say, driving it all the time because they happen to pick up an Uber business, right? And I think that plays to a sense of fairness in insurance. People want to contribute to the system where if any of us suffers, sort of misfortune, we will contribute to a system that helps each other. But we want the system to be fair. We don't want to subsidize, anybody's poor decisions or increased exposures, right? Other examples to your point of health, we're exploring this too. How do you sort of credit people with good behavior, right? Like social economic determinants of health, where you could credit lower premiums for healthier lifestyles. I think that's something a lot of insurers are exploring. I don't know, if we've necessarily cracked this yet. We do get into issues that you had mentioned. Let's touch upon what Charles was talking about. How do you do this with, personal or sensitive information? I think there are ways around that with, let's say, tokenizing it and just looking at attributes across, individuals and not necessarily knowing who they are or what they're doing. But there's so many ways to approach it, and I don't know if I have a specific one, and I don't know if anybody's cracked it yet. But in line with this concept of can you react quicker to trend, and can you differentiate risks more fairly? I think if we stick to those, two areas, right? If we react quicker and it's actually credible, we know that there is a definite change in trend. Or if you can differentiate between your customers in a fair way, I think we'll come up with something great with this.
Yeah. Jeffrey, as a heads up, I planned poorly because the next question should go to you first. So you're about to talk again, but I will say on that, that's a really good point that moving from reacting to things and trying to plan this out a little bit more and think, okay, what are we seeing? Where is this heading, and starting the work to figure out what kinds of products, what kinds of solutions, services, et cetera, and engagement can we enable because of this, so that we're doing things proactively and with full thought. And it just because it's different on the data side doesn't mean it's it's wrong or bad. And you see that a lot in underwriting decision making, the concern about redlining and whether the underwriting is discriminatory. And so when there's a change, that sort of brings that all back to a head, but maybe actually this is enabling us to move away from some of those risks because we have better insight and are doing things more honestly, relative to what the risk actually is versus the assumptions we've had to make historically because we lacked some of that insight. So I said, you're going to get the next question. And this is because you seeded this with the cultural change that you brought up. And I think it's an interesting one for everyone to talk about is, how you've dealt with some of the cultural barriers or the resistance or the discomfort, even because it's new or different or, not what people are used to. Seeing where culture has been an impediment to some of the change and how you've worked with people in the business to try to move that forward. So some of the things that helped you make the culture issue a non-issue or less of an issue.
I think Kjersten talked about this too, in terms of working with the business, right? So there's a lot of ontological uncertainty when we start talking about digitizing processes and automation, and we can go so much faster and more efficiently. Naturally, in the business, if you're a claims paying process, or if you're an underwriting process, or you're booking premium or evaluating risk, you're going to feel maybe threatened or challenged by this. And the way that I personally have approached this is to just have conversations with these teams to say, you are the ones that are really going to drive the innovation in the process. And by doing so, you're not going to enable somebody to come in and just start paying your claims or adjudicate. Nobody's coming to save you to adjudicate your claims. That's not going to happen. It's really, how do you accelerate and create processes that make insurance so much more efficient and effective, that we can reduce the costs, so we can start making insurance accessible to other parts of our population. I think we talk about at Swiss Re sort of the protection gap and being able to make insurance cost effective enough to help other people. We also talk about how we can start using data to be more sustainable. And then I think we talk about how we can just make it a little bit more fair. I think as insurers, we have this tendency to think about selection, anti-selection, profitability, and blind spots. And we want to use AI and data to really cherry pick out the good business. But I think if you play that thought exercise out, then it's sort of a race to the bottom, right? And we could do so much more, right? And if you and every function plays a part, right? In imagining how we can get out of emails, out of sort of dashboards, out of Excel, and start thinking about how do we design these workflows that start to challenge the limits of what we can do as a process, and really expand what we can do in terms of intuition, right? In terms of expert systems, right? If you can get, the processes excited about this, culturally, I think it is hard, because we're all used to, know what happens if this email comes in, I have to do it this way. But, you really have to break people from, thinking about the problems in the context of sort of legacy systems, and really show them what's possible, and just show that they're enabled and can unleash some creativity.
Yeah, so it's giving them a vision of what is enabled from this.
They should feel empowered.
Yeah, empowered is a great word. Kjersten, you just came off mute, so I'm guessing
you exactly. So I raised my hand. So I think just to underscore what Jeff said, it's I keep kind of coming back to that intersection with the business strategy. And if you're kind of taking data and usage data into the realm of business strategy, then you're really starting to make it less about a data or an analytics roadmap and what is the strategic and the resulting roadmap kind of from the business perspective. And so the shared outcomes that you create are really more business outcomes that are enabled by data and analytical use cases. And I think very important as part of that kind of piece of work is to say, look, the transformation that this type of capability represents means that as a business leader, you're going to kind of take your hands off the wheel in how you run your business or manage your people in sort of the pre-way. And we also need to be thinking about how you are sort of understanding, governing, leading your business kind of post-transformation that we're talking about. So it's not just the work itself, it's also those mechanisms and techniques for leadership, for people development, sort of change management, if you will, within the business area. And I think kind of when you put those two things together, thinking about not only, all right, what are kind of the strategic contributors of data analytics into the business strategy, and then how are we thinking about that change management and kind of the evolution within the business, you really start to generate trust. And it's on the basis of that trust that the cultural change, those sort of resistance barriers start to come down much faster than they otherwise would.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. Wayne, is that something that you've experienced as well? Do you see it the same way, or have you had maybe different challenges of cultural acceptance throughout the organization and how you've navigated them?
I would say a similar experience. So, so definitely it's kind of related to what Kjersten was saying about change management, and also what Jeff was talking about, the existing way of doing things. So I think key is really as a data scientist and a special lead is really to communicate. It's only through this communication, and then to let people realize that where's the future may goes, right? And then whether the existing way of doing business, is it still sustainable, or is there better options to do things, and that could achieve same strategic objective, either increase revenue or reduce cost, and make the operation less friction. So these are really kind of the challenge of the data scientists, that to communicate with our business partners and also the co-workers, that these maybe new way of doing things and could be better, but then and just kind of negotiate through the process, right? So like there's just so many existing processes in there, or a way of doing things like assumptions. It's been developed for years. What is to say that use this kind of machine learning model would be better to replace a better assumption that can reduce the risk? Or how do we select the customers? So we know, and there's people has 20, 30 years experience in this industry, and then you say, well, this model may do a better work. So these, I think, require very delicate communication, and be just kind of case by case, that we need to just talk through each of the situations.
Yeah, and it's interesting that everyone's intelligent people in the business, and they can understand the benefits of it. But when it comes down to, look, this is what I've done for 20 years, it's second nature to me, or 10 years or 30. And even though I understand that this is better, it's still hard to make that shift. And so I think you're absolutely right, is recognizing that instead of just trying to push through because it's a smarter way of working. Charles, you had opened up with this story, or went to the story in your opening remarks about West Bend, and that sort of, I would imagine the agents were not thrilled with the new solution, and obviously the engagement numbers who would show that. So it's more than just the internal side, it's also the external constituents, customers, partners, distribution, et cetera. What are some of the things you've seen to help with that?
Yeah, I think, obviously by the time insurers come to us, it's most likely because they've already decided, or at least they're seriously considering thinking about digitizing their operations and that sort of thing. I think our job as Liferay is to come alongside them, because that digital leap, it seems really scary, but if we can break down that leap into smaller digital steps, it'll help them feel more comfortable about, moving in that direction. I think to Wayne's point about, communicate, like that seriously is the most important thing. To not just say like, we come in, and a lot of times our clients will say like, this is exactly what we want. But then at the same time, we kind of understand the whole digital space. We can speak to them and say like, have you considered this? Have you considered that? There's a lot of considerations out there that maybe our clients haven't considered. And so our goal really isn't to just build exactly what they say, but then to help elicit just an understanding of what are the important factors to consider going in that direction. And then together, I think from both sides, we can come up with an optimal solution.
Yeah, there's this consistent theme, right, of collaboration, but of thinking about how is this moving the business strategy forward, from Kjersten's original comment all the way through really what everyone has shared. There's another collaboration point that someone has raised, and we have 5 minutes to get to get thoughts from all of you on this. So I'm going to ask for a one-liner on this, if you can. What about the role of regulators or public agencies here? Should we be waiting as an industry for those guidelines to know what we can operate in? Should we be partnering with them to help define them? Should we be trying to pave the way? Are there things they can do to support us? If there's something that comes to mind from the regulatory side that could help enable the kind of change, like having products that can be continuously underwritten and change as the exposure changes. Jeff, maybe you can open us up on this one.
If you think insurance is slow to change, I would say regulatory moves a lot slower than we do. Of course, we should try to partner, but I think if we just stick to the theme of, we want to build products that are fair and don't bias against, things that people just can't help, then we should pretty much stay out of trouble.
It's good guideline. Kjersten, how about yourself?
So I think it's partner, and part of that partnering, that active partnering, is to contribute thought leadership and help with the education, help with the kind of empathy that the regulators and the subsequent regulations can help express. So definitely think it's a partnership without being necessarily kind of in a victim role, but to contribute kind of thought leadership and help with the education there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because remembering their reason for existing is not to put rules on us, it's to help protect customers, make sure that people stay solvent, protected, et cetera. So it's all
exactly
right intentions, and so which we have too. We're there for people in their worst moments as well, right? So
exactly
very similar intentions.
Exactly.
Wayne, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too.
Sure. So I think in different states, the regulators have different kind of mindset about the insured carriers. So in our home state, then we try to take the approach to work with our regulators, just inform them what we're doing, so kind of transparent, and then know what direction we're going. And like what Jeff was saying, that we try to be fair and consider things that they would have considered already, so that way we can work in peace.
Yeah, that's a good point. Consideration, absolutely, is the right word to go into it with. Charles, how about yourself? I know your take on this might be a little bit different because you're seeing across different contexts and different carriers and situations and partners, and maybe you're seeing some of the ways that, although well-intentioned, given where the world has changed, maybe there's a need for some shifts in the rules that we have at our disposal right now.
Yeah, I think the key word from our side, from the solution provider side, is just flexibility, right? With all the different regulations that change a lot and are coming in different ways and for different regions, we just need to be flexible and making sure that the customers that we work with feel like we've considered all the different possibilities and allow them to be able to maintain their business in the way that they need to, as they are sort of maybe forced to do things a certain way because of regulations.
Great. So we still have another minute, so I'm gonna try to wrap up a few things, because there was quite a bit of brilliance here, and of course we still have lots of questions left. Before we went live, I said that we would have tons of questions that we can't even get close to answering. So thank you to the audience for submitting so many great questions throughout. It was really thought-provoking stuff. From the panel, there were a few thoughts that I think everyone should be taking away with them. And look, we've hit on them a number of times. Kjersten, you brought it right from the start about this connection between the business strategy and data strategy, and how data is intertwined with that. Certainly going forward, if you really want to be where the market is heading and what customers are expecting from you, which, and Charles, to your point about not asking customers to bend to the data, the limitations of it, or the needs we have in populating it in multiple different places in different ways, which should not mean asking them for it in multiple different places in different ways. As one example. Jeffrey, quite a few really good points of yours, some from Wayne that I attributed to you, but you had your great ones nonetheless. But you were the first one to bring up the cultural piece. And, we just had a whole discussion about that. So that is absolutely something to think about is, we can be creating brilliant things and thinking about how do we actually see them come to market? Well, that's through our people throughout the organization. So bringing them along for the journey and helping them to see not just here's the new thing you have to use and it's smart, but here's the benefits to it and why it's a good thing for all of us. And Wayne, this continuous notion, you had a few great points, but that was one that is literally shifting major parts of P&C and life health right now, life annuities and health. So really keen to bring that up because that is an enabler of different customer engagement, different products, different ways of looking at claims, et cetera. So there are a few things that I hope people took notes on from this. Thank you so much to the panel for all the great commentary and to the audience again for the questions. Thanks all.